Welcome everyone to today's webinar for European Metals Holdings Limited, ASX code EMH. Many of you would be aware that overnight the European Commission declared Cinovec to be a strategic project under the recently implemented Critical Raw Materials Act, or otherwise known as the CRMA. This news follows the recent announcement that the Cinovec mineral deposit has also been designated a strategic deposit for the purpose of the Czech Construction Code. These announcements are extremely important to European Metals, and I would now like to introduce EMH Executive Chairman Keith Coughlan, who will talk through these developments and what they mean for the company and the development of Cinovec. Keith's also able to answer any questions you may have on this news. If you do have a question, submit it using the Q&A function on your screen, and I'll put these to Keith directly. You will see we're not giving a formal presentation, rather we are going to go through the news of today and allow Keith to put that news in his own words and you to ask any questions you may have. So Keith, over to you.
Hi David, thanks very much for having me on today. So yes, a very important development for us overnight. I'm very happy to see the market reaction to that news, both in London last night and so far today on the ASX. It's news that we have expected for a while, but it's always obviously still very nice to see it made official. The CRMA has been in various stages of development in the EU for some time now. We made our submissions, very extensive submissions, over the course of last year. So very good to see that work come to fruition. A lot of work has gone into this at all levels, both the project company level and both shareholders, EMH and chairs, have put a lot of work into this. What's critical are the two main tenets of the CRMA, which are the assistance in the provision of finance for building projects like Cinovec, and also improving the permitting timelines and process to enable quicker. And mining in Europe is not something that there's been a lot of in recent years, and so from an investor point of view, those two factors have been important for people to understand really for as long as we've been involved in the project. That is, how long is it going to take to get your permits? Are you going to get your permits? And how are you going to fund this project? It's a very big project. And that's been emphasised in recent years. We saw Rio Tinto lose their permits in Serbia, which they've now got back. But that uncertainty is never good for the market, and shareholders like to see a measure of certainty. So apart from anything else, this announcement helps us with both of those things significantly. From a financing point of view, I don't believe it's any coincidence that last Friday the European Investment Bank made an announcement of their renewed commitment to funding projects in the EU, in security, defence, but also in critical minerals. And they went on to say that they've doubled their budget of the money they will lend into critical mineral projects in the EU in the coming years. They stipulated specifically that they had an additional 2 billion euros to invest into the resource sector for critical minerals this year. That is 2025, and that's a very significant statement. We will be talking formally to EIB at the conclusion of our definitive feasibility study in the middle of the year, and looking to be the recipient of a portion of those funds that they are looking to get into the system this year. So that's very important to us. We already have a dialogue with EIB and others, all the various financiers you'd expect us to be talking to across the region and outside the region, but the conversations become more real and more formal with the conclusion of the definitive feasibility study, which incidentally is on track. And statements like this from the EIB are very comforting. The other factor, the permitting that I mentioned, has always been something that investors in other parts of the world ask me about. What's the permitting like in Europe? It's hard, it's long, it's slow, and it has been those things. The Critical Raw Materials Act stipulates specific maximum timelines for permitting, which go further towards giving us certainty about the project and with giving investors the confidence that the project will go ahead and in a timely fashion. So the important thing to understand now is the momentum that this is building. There's been a significant geopolitical shift in the world since the US election, where tariffs and uncertainty for markets in various parts of the world, I think, have pushed the EU further into ensuring that critical mineral security is very high on their internal agenda. And I think those sort of things help with getting projects like Cinovec into production, so that there is a measure of mineral security within the EU to facilitate the energy transition. This momentum has been evidenced. David, you mentioned earlier that a couple of weeks ago now we made an announcement that the project had been designated a strategic deposit under Czech law. So that was really the first of these public statements by governments. That then leads into the CRMA decision last night, or the announcement of the CRMA decision last night. I think the third step in that will be the final approval of the Just Transition Fund monies that we have been pre-approved for some time ago. Shareholders might remember that the project has been pre-approved for a €30 million grant from the Just Transition Fund. I think the momentum we're seeing with those two other things that I've just spoken about will lead to the final announcement of the JTF money being available to us, and all of this builds momentum for us. And really, as much as I would have liked to have seen this CRMA announcement earlier, we expected it as early as late last year. It's actually, I think, better for us that it's happening right now because of that momentum and what's happening globally and where it leads for us into the conclusion of our definitive feasibility study.
Thanks, Keith. A couple of questions starting to come through. As I said, if you've got any questions, please submit them using the Q&A button on the screen. Yeah, you alluded to it. There's lots of pieces to these sort of puzzles. So when you are developing a project such as this on such a large scale and so many key stakeholders, there are a lot of pieces to put the puzzle together. How important are these pieces to the overall puzzle?
Well, I think it's vital. I've considered for some time that it's a matter of getting the various important groups together to enable a project like Cinovec. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, mainstream mining really hasn't been on the agenda in the EU for some years. So it's something a little different. And it requires the will of various groups to come together to make sure projects like ours get permits, get funded, and get brought into production. And those groups, in no particular order, you've obviously got the Czech government, who clearly are fully on board with us. You've got the central government in Brussels, and the CRMA indicates their support of the project. And then outside the government organisations, you have financiers. So as I mentioned, EIB, the major, if you like, public financier in Europe, and the announcement last week from the EIB. There are other groups as well, people like KfW in Germany. The German government has a recently announced €2 billion critical raw materials fund, money to be made available to projects who deliver product into German industry, which clearly we're hoping we will be. And then you've got those customers themselves, the off-takers, and it's like no one really wants to be first. No one wants first. They want the comfort that the whole group is on board. And as the whole group comes on board, which is clearly happening, then you have the project enabled, and all we need to do now is deliver that DFS and bring all the groups together to enable the project, get the money raised, get the permits in place, and build it.
Now, you touched on the timing, I suppose, of the CRMA and it was announced some time ago that EMH was successful in the initial part of that process. What was the process, and why do you think it took so long?
Well, the CRMA itself was announced some time ago, well over a year ago, and it was initially in response to the American IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that was announced by the Biden government. And the EU saw that they needed to do something similar. Now, you know, the US is a single nation, and the decision made in Washington is immediately enacted. It's immediately binding. That's not the case in the EU. You know, you've got a collection of member states that all have to come together, that have to debate legislation, give their agreement, etc. Everyone needs to get on board. So you've got that to begin with, and that's one of the reasons why it takes longer. Then, as you can probably imagine, there was a significant number of applicants who put their hands up to be recognised as strategic projects under this CRMA legislation. And so it takes the selection committee considerable time to work through those projects. But it's a very, very exhaustive due diligence process that was undertaken by the CRMA committee. And this in itself should give further comfort to our shareholders and to the market, to the financiers, that there has been a tremendous amount of due diligence done on the project on all levels of the project. You know, we effectively had to get 2 approvals for our project because we're not only a mining operation, but separately we're a processing operation, and the 2 aspects of the project were looked at separately. And that, you know, that should give you more comfort, I believe, that the due diligence process has been long, arduous, very involved, and, you know, and come up with a successful outcome.
Just on that, a question's come through, which I think is pertinent. You did have to go through, as a number of projects did, quite an exhaustive due diligence process. Does that due diligence pack get handed over to potential financiers or other EU funding groups to say, hey, you guys don't need to go and do all this work because we, as the CRMA committee or organisation, have done that bit of work for you?
So 2 parts to that question. Firstly, yes, that'll definitely form the basis of our discussions with all of the groups you mentioned. But, you know, specifically, if you think about our number 1 target for funding assistance being the European Investment Bank, another branch of the EU, you know, you would imagine that EIB and the EU, the EC, and the CRMA committee, you know, have been talking together. They don't operate in vacuums, and all of that information will be available to EIB. You know, I can't imagine that someone like EIB would turn around and start from scratch to start performing their own due diligence. You know, that would be it would be meaningless and, you know, doubling up. So that will definitely happen. The commercial banks will probably still do their own due diligence because they need to do so, but I imagine it would be an abbreviated form of the due diligence process. You know, the other important thing is that, you know, I mentioned a group of enabling organisations in the EU that helps this happen. You know, the significance of this announcement and the support, the tacit support that we see from someone like EIB is also very important to our potential off-takers. And, you know, they too want to see projects like ours. You know, they don't want into an off-take with a project that they don't think is going to get into production. Obviously, that has happened previously. And so having the support of CRMA, the support, as I say, tacit support of EIB, gives those people greater confidence also to put together the sort of offtake contract that we want to see. So not, you know, not just a wishy-washy, you know, agreement, but an offtake agreement that has real meat on it.
I'll come back to offtake in a second, but there is a question regarding DFS, which you did mention during the sort of the introductory chat. You're zeroing in on that. These pieces are obviously very important, but how is it progressing, and are you still on track?
Yeah, we're still on track from a timeline point of view. all aspects. The team are working very, very hard. They are aware of how important it is for us to deliver this on time, given the delays that we've previously had. But also, as I mentioned earlier, the timing of this and EIB announcements and what have you make the delivery of our DFS, in the middle of the year even more important because, for the reason of the momentum that I mentioned earlier.
Now, I am aware that you were in the EU only a couple of weeks ago. Was the primary purpose of that visit to bed this down, or were you there for other reasons?
Yeah, I was there until the end of last week. No, the CRMA work had been completed, as I say, last year. Early this year, there were some, like in January, we had to do a little bit of follow-up work on it to answer specific questions that were coming back from the committee. But no, my most recent trip wasn't with regards to the CRMA. It was other project-based work and, discussions with potential financiers, potential customers, off-takers.
Obviously, don't want to go too deep into the detail of those discussions, but there's a question here. Current lithium price, not just your project, but a lot of projects globally are tough at current prices. Are the groups you're talking to as potential financiers or offtake partners or supply partners, are they more interested in the certainty of supply or the price of the product?
Well, they're interested in both. The certainty of supply is becoming more of an issue, as I just mentioned, with regards to geopolitical issues. And certainly there are incentives for European off-takers to secure a portion of their critical raw materials from within Europe, from within the EU. But, price is always going to be a factor. They're still running a business. Excuse me. They're still running a business and, they're not going to, pay double the price just for security or to get something within their own region. There are benefits. The benefits from a pricing point of view or from a project economics point of view for us is in areas like the provision of debt from someone like EIB that comes at something significantly less than commercial rates. The provision of grants like the Just Transition Fund, for example, 30 million euros, which is not an insignificant amount of money, but more importantly, ensures that we are in the mix for potentially other grants. I mentioned the German government's critical raw material fund, etc. And if you like, all of these things help projects reduce their capex, reduce their opex, cost of production, etc., etc. Having said that, we would all love to see a better lithium price. And I've obviously looked at the lithium price on a daily basis for many years now. I still don't get it. I read every week at the moment EV numbers going up 50% year on year for the month of February. All of those cars, all of that increased production of cars needs lithium in it, and yet apparently the Chinese spot price hasn't moved. So the people we're talking to are now significantly more educated on the dynamics of the lithium market and what might be a realistic price to peg future supply at in terms of floors and ceilings. And it's possible that it's not, that they don't expect it to be what we read when we look up the current Chinese spot price.
So maybe taking that into consideration and without taking us deep into the discussions you're having, because clearly they are confidential and incomplete, how do both sides mitigate price and supply, and what does a perfect deal start to look like on both sides?
Look, we would like to see an offtake agreement that from a price, and forget the other, conditions such as investment and prepayments and those sorts of things that the people in the market would have read as features in other people's offtake agreements that have been announced over the years. So we're not, it's not like we're breaking any new ground there. Those sort of features have appeared in a number of publicly disclosed offtake agreements in the past. But from a pricing point of view, we're angling for the future price, the price that the product is at that point in time, but with a floor and ceiling mechanism, floor price to protect our downside, a ceiling price to protect the OEM's downside, and that becomes a very bankable contract, obviously subject to what that floor price is. Now, that does obviously cap your upside, and if you are a bull on the lithium price and you think it's going higher, it was $78,000 a tonne not so many years ago, then you might be a little disappointed with having to give away a cap. But the question is, what portion of your overall annual production do you need to set on that sort of pricing mechanism to fund the project? And does that then allow you to have a portion of your annual production that you can make a decision on whether you want to leave at spot price for lithium price upside? And that would be an ideal situation. The other thing, of course, is we announced in December the concept study leading towards a potential increase in production for the project. And as we've said to the market in a few announcements last year, we have moved the processing plant site to Prunerov, which is a much larger site, which enables us to significantly increase production from a processing plant point of view. And, obviously none of that potential product is the subject of any hedging anyway. So there are a few ways, I think, to mitigate that, to ensure that, number one, you get the project built, which is absolutely my first job, and you need a bankable offtake to do that. But number two, you allow for as much upside as possible. We are lithium bulls. I'm a lithium bull. I'm not saying I'm seeing it back at $78,000 a tonne, but neither do we need to set anywhere near $78,000 a tonne for Cinovec to make a great deal of money every year.
Like I said, not to break confidentialities or disclose anything that hasn't been disclosed to the market, but you did say that you are talking to potential offtake partners. Is that type of agreement that you've referenced there realistic?
Well, yeah, without breaking confidence, I'd have to say yes, it's realistic.
I get much clearer than that. Last question, where to from here? What should investors now be focusing on? Two big pieces have dropped into the puzzle.
Yep.
So what other pieces should they be looking for?
So I think you look at it in three different parts. We are doing our work with the DFS, and that will go along without a lot of noise in the public arena, because it's just work being done behind the scenes. We have made announcements over the past 6 months about enhancements to the process, to the project, that will impact the DFS in a positive way. We may see a couple more of those between now and the conclusion of the DFS. Obviously, we can't change too much now because we're pretty much locked in, but we are still working on tweaks. So that's the first part, if you like, project technical issues and news. Secondly, and importantly, as we've seen from the market reaction to these two bits of news that have dropped into place in the last 2 or 3 weeks, is other macro, if you like, factors like that. The next of which I would hope to be the final approval of the Just Transition Fund money, which puts 30 million euros into the project company for expenditure purposes, early stage. Sorry, I'll clarify that. 30 million euros doesn't appear in our bank account. We get to draw down on that for previously designated and defined sub-projects. So that obviously is another big tick of confidence to the market, but also to the European system. And then thirdly, things like offtake, corporate link-ups, partnerships, this sort of thing. So those are the pieces of news that I'm working feverishly towards delivering to the market between now and DFS Day.
Thanks, Keith. Clearly got the macro momentum on your side, and some big pieces of the puzzle falling into place. And as you've just mentioned, a few more to go over the coming months that will really define this project and the development of it over the coming years. So, Keith, thanks for your time. Thanks for participating in the Q&A, and thank you, everyone, for listening today and for tuning in. More news to come. Keep it on the watch list. Keep watching. But most of all, have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. And also just thanks to our shareholders. I know it's been a tough ride. Hopefully we can deliver more positive news like this to you, to the market, as soon